All right. We created a Stella model to parallel the situation with the smoking in the United States, because we realized that smoking is a major problem, costs a lot of money every single year, and we wanted to figure out a way to reduce the smoking rate however possible. And Americans have been smoking for an incredibly long time. It was started since our country was founded, but through more industrial and cultural advances, the smoking rate has changed over the past years, and especially since the 20s and in the 50s, the smoking rate has shot up quite a bit, and it does hurt our healthcare system as well as the average citizen. Here we have a picture of a behavior over time graph. I think the text is a little bit hard to see, but I'll try to explain it anyway. From this portion, the black part of the line right here, this shows what has been going on in the past. This is representing what, like the 20s and 50s era, how the smoking rate has shot way up. And there are two possible scenarios. Now we're going to try to get the desired one, which is the green, through our model. But we have a feeling that if we don't do anything, if the government doesn't intervene, and if we don't do any changes to what is going on with smoking in our country right now, then the smoking rate will continue to rise, or at least remain steady, which is unhealthy as it currently is. All right, so should we go to the model? Or?
Yeah. Okay, so this is the beginning of our model. Right now we have the supply and demand portion, and what we're modeling is the amount of cigarette packs in the United States. And we have an actual supply and an actual demand of the cigarette packs for each person. And then the normal supply and normal demand is what people are actually buying or using. And then we have the normal price and the effect of the price on supply and effective price on demand, because they each influence how much of the supply is used and how many cigarette packs are wanted. And the normal price affects both of those. And then next we have inventory coverage, which shows how many cigarette packs storekeepers or cigarette companies would want to have, so that there's enough cigarette packs for each person to have one, and then the desired inventory is affected by that. And actual demand goes into that, because generally the desired inventory is a couple times the actual demand. And that affects the suggested price, and the actual price as well goes into the suggested price, which also affects the demand and supply. So then our gap is the difference between the actual price and the suggested price, and the delay time of how long, yeah, and
it was a year or something like that?
yeah, it's about a year.
So it would take about a year for the companies to realize what the price should be at and what it currently is at. And so the gap kind of represents that they're trying to fill up that space over time.
And then after that time, the prices are changed and then there's a perceived price, which also goes back into the actual price. Is this your part?
Okay. And so the actual price from the cigarette packs is broken into two parts. One is price to companies and the actual price to government. And this is the part that we feel that we can control based on a tax. So if we have a tax over here, percent, then we can change the amount of money that the government gets from the actual price, is it or lower it. But you preferably, in the final model, want to make the tax as low as possible so the consumers would accept it, but high enough that it would effectively reduce the smoking rate. And that just breaks up the price into two different segments. And the price to companies, a portion of that goes to buy more cigarette packs so they can keep their own industry going, as seen here. But in this whole section of the model down below is designed for one smoker, because we haven't yet added in a part to make a figure for the entire population. So that's the next part of our model, which is the population segment, to really figure out the correct number of smokers, which would affect the actual supply and demand. So we have our population segment up here broken into two different age groups because we figured that the majority of smokers, if they were smoking consistently, would be aged about 15 and up, and that's what we were able to get statistics for. And so we created an aging chain right here where people are put into the category of 0 to 14, they age 15 and up. And of course, there's just in a typical population chain, there's the birth rate that goes on where the people age 15 and up are also able to reproduce and contribute to the population 0 to 14. And the section, people age 15 and up, goes down here. And there's a portion of that goes into the number of smokers. It's multiplied by the smoking rate, which we'll figure out later. And in addition, we had to figure out the death rate for both categories because we figured that there would be a portion of people in both categories that are dying, and so we had to factor that in too. But now the section of the model that relates, if you remember back down here when we broke down the price into price to companies and price to government, that part is going to come into play right here, where we can show the total number of cigarette packs sold multiplied by the price to companies, and also the total number of cigarette packs sold multiplied by the price to government to show the total price to government and the total price to companies. So that's the total amount of money that both of them are getting. And the companies are going to try to spend it on advertising and promoting their own products so that more people will smoke, while the government is trying to spend it on anti-smoking education to get less people to smoke. And so you can see two kind of counteracting behaviors going on here as the companies try to increase the smoking rate and the government tries to decrease it. So we have the section of it, because they're not going to spend all their profits on education or all their profits from either of them on education or on advertisement. So there's a section of it that's going towards that. And we have it down here just to make the model a bit more realistic. The percent of total price that companies spend on ads, that part is subtracted from the amount that the companies can spend on buying more cigarette packs. But back to this part of the model with the advertising and education, it basically comes down to this effect, which shows which one is gaining an advantage overall, and this influences the smoking rate right here, which is the effect multiplied by the percent of people normally smoking, which gets us a realistic number of smokers. We figured that in this model, the things that people could change is the percent of total money to government spent on anti-smoking education and the tax in percent. We figured that we could change these two things and see how that works out and if it effectively reduces the number of smokers and the percent of people actually smoking.
So here we have our feedback loops. First one is the effect of cigarette packs on the actual supply, and we believe it's counteracting because once you go around, as the cigarette packs are increased, the actual supply will increase, but the effective advertising and education on the smoking rate will go down. And then the next feedback loop we have is the effect of cigarette packs on the actual demand. And this is reinforcing because as cigarette packs increase, it will increase each of the following values. And so as it gets back to actual demand, if it increases, the cigarette packs will increase as well.
And this is just basically showing that if the companies gain control, then they'll be able to make more and more cigarette packs, get more and more people to smoke. And if there isn't a significant enough tax or government intervention, then the smoking rate will continue to rise considerably. But on the other hand, if the government gains control with a high enough tax, then they'll be able to keep the amount of smokers in check. And as more people smoke, the amount of money to the government increases because of the tax, and we're able to spend on anti-smoking education, which lowers the smoking rate. So it just basically shows whichever gains the upper hand, companies or government, they'll gain control of the entire situation.
And then here are a couple of our final graphs, the ones that we experimented with. The top one shows the cigarette packs, the actual price, and the percent of people actually smoking with an increase in tax, 2 step ups. So the percent of people smoking goes down, and the actual price seems to oscillate more, while cigarette packs steadily decreases.
Just to clarify here, on these graphs, after 5 years, what we're showing is that the tax will jump up. It will almost double, I think.
Yeah.
And that, as you can see that in the green line right there, there's a divot after 5 years. And after 10 years, we have it where the government spends, I think, twice as much money on anti-smoking education, assuming that they started out spending only like 1/10 of their total profit from cigarette taxes to the anti-smoking education, and that drops it even more. And the pink line right there, that shows the actual price. And we have a feeling that if the actual price can stay fairly consistent, then the consumers won't be overly angry, because if the taxes are going up, then the companies are also going to have to try to raise the prices to make up for the profits that they lost. But the actual price doesn't increase outrageously with this scenario, so we figured that it would be fairly effective. And you can see on the second graph here, the red line represents the money to cigarette advertising, which, as you can see, it starts out much higher than the amount of money to anti-smoking education. But with our measures implemented on the tax and the redistribution of money spent on education, the government gets an upper hand by the end of 10 to 20 years and stays consistently that way.
Yeah, so these both show the same scenario with different values. And then what we've learned is an increased tax would pretty much solve the problem, and as more people would buy the cigarettes, there would be more money going to the anti-smoking education, because the tax would go to the government, which would then work on the anti-smoking. And if the tax increase, the government spending goes up, which raises it above the cigarette company spending. So if the tax keeps increasing, cigarette company spending would go down, and there would be less cigarettes available.
So, kind of in conclusion, I just think that through this model we've learned that it actually is possible to really limit the number of smokers in the U.S. in a really effective way, just by possibly pushing some legislation through, and that the government definitely does have the ability to make smoking a self-solving problem, which would be a great thing if we could get it implemented.